Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. We are so excited to be back on with another episode. And joining me today is Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing?
I'm upright.
He is upright. So, what week is this now?
For my baby.
Yes.
She just turned a month old on Friday.
All right. So, about 4 weeks, four or
Yeah.
5 weeks. So,
Mhm.
great. Wonderful.
Let's just keep a tab every week when we record this and see how old she is.
Yeah. We'll start seeing. We know things get bad when your beard starts turning gray. It's like, uh-oh, he's stressed out.
Like yours?
Oh, yeah, dude. My
Would Peter
kids are
what
my
what
kids
what
are
Peter break this week, or what did Lizzie do
no,
this
but
week?
actually we finally were able to get in early to children's to have them go see a behavioral specialist to
Peter?
so I mean he's a great kid, and he doesn't cause any problems. The problem is we think he's very fidgety, so we kind of assume that maybe he has like ADHD. But his PCP had a thing on their website where they could do a chart, like almost like a questionnaire where I would fill it out, Laura would fill it out, and then the teacher would fill it out. And this would help kind of help determine if he is has
Uh,
ADHD. Well, we
yeah.
did that test and nothing. Like they said, nope, based on the results, we don't think he's eligible for ADHD. It's like, okay. But they said if you want to, you could go and get an assessment at children. So that's what we did. But it was going to be a year out. Like we weren't going to see anybody until October. And luckily, they had a cancellation, so we're able to see him last week. And we sat there for an hour. We did some interviews. We talked everything else, and the counselor is going to kind of like go through all her notes. I even gave her a copy of all the stuff that my wife and I filled out, and the teacher, and from there we will see kind of what happens if but I mean it's weird because this one's more of like going to therapy to kind of help give some strategies and tips to kind of help
Yeah.
navigate any type of attention stuff, where our other meeting in October, because we had to set up 2 appointments, the other two is thinking, does he need medication? So we're kind of still waiting for that to happen. And if he does get an official diagnosis, then he might be able to have an aid, which might help him kind of keep him focused on doing his homework or doing any in class work.
Does she do well in school?
He does do well. Like so, the concern that happened was in the fall, we noticed that when they had their first like standard test that they had to take, everything plummeted real quickly, which is kind of raised for alarm because he's usually so good, especially when it comes to reading and math and everything. Um, but then what was happening is he would sneak his school laptop upstairs when Laura and I weren't looking, and he would be up until like 3 o'clock in the morning playing on his computer. And because of that, um, he'd be have like a sleep, which means he wasn't doing well in school. So once we told the school, don't have him bring home his computer, and they just kept it there, and they kept it there for pretty much most of the year. I think a month before school ended, he finally got his computer back. Um, but when they did that, everything started to improve again. So it's kind of one of those things like, okay, well, is it ADHD? Which maybe because he is fidgety, he does have some things that he, or maybe he's just bored. And that's the other thing too. Like, we found out that my dad had an undiagnosed ADHD assessment, but he's like a CFO for like a multi-billion-dollar company. He's undiagnosed ADHD, not taking any meds for that. And apparently I have it, which I don't think that's surprising to anybody who knows me. but but again, like
It
it
makes
didn't
so
bother
much
me.
sense.
But again, like I did well in school. I didn't have any, but now my sister has it, and she didn't do well in school. She's actually taken medicine for it. So I feel like it's kind of that like, are you high
Hit and
functioning?
miss thing.
It's
Yeah.
a hit and miss thing. And I'm just like, well, Peter, it's like, okay, like if he has it, like, is he going to turn out to be like me, which is like, he's going to be very creative, high functioning, can be very, sometimes may get distracted, but once he's focused on a task, he really will dominate it, everything he does. Or he's going to be like my sister, where it's like, okay, you're going to have to need help because obviously they're not doing well in school. As things get progressively challenging in school, I don't want him to keep falling behind, because not because he's not smart, but because he has a disorder that is not helping contribute to his education. So, we'll see. We're playing it by ear, but that was a very long story. My goodness, I didn't. But there you go. That's what's going on with my life and my son.
It's okay.
So before we dive into our topic, which is our topic today, we're going to be talking about kind of like using social media with your teens. So this one would be especially important for youth workers, youth pastors, and even just regular pastors, just to kind of know, like, how do you connect with your students through social media? Should you do it? If you do, what's the benefits? What's the harm? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we begin, stories gone wild. Micah, do you have a stories gone wild?
I mean, not so much as stories gone wild, but like I know that we're not necessarily we're not a news podcast by any means. And I know that last week we talked about Donald Trump, the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, but like I feel like the news just keeps giving us stuff. And as the news broke yesterday, President Biden decided that he was going to step down from the 2024 race. And I was texting with a friend of mine yesterday, and it was like, it's just fascinating. U.S. history is fascinating. We're living in a fascinating time. Whether you agree with the candidates or not, whether you side one way or the other, it's truly a fascinating scenario that the country is now facing because of Biden deciding to not seek reelection. And I think he's the first one since Lyndon Johnson to do that. But the crazy thing is that I think they said on the news yesterday, it was 106 days until the election. That's not including early voting. Yeah. And then this is the soonest that a sitting president has decided that they will not see reelection, like closest to the actual election day that the president has decided they're not going to seek reelection. What do you think of all that? That's crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like you mentioned at the beginning about the news, and it seems like they're just putting so much information. And I feel like the news, in some ways, it's their job to kind of report stuff as it's happening. And I think that's kind of one of the benefits about social media and living in a digital age is people can get information very quickly. And sometimes, like, I mean, I don't know, I think even leading up to it, I kept hearing like, oh, there's rumblings that Joe Biden is going to not run as president anymore. Or there's people saying, oh, no, he's fighting against it. And it's just a constant like volleyball matches, bumping and hitting and spiking. And there's so much stuff going on. Then finally, you get to the point where, okay, now it's actually real breaking news that he is stepping down. It's like, but I mean, I was hearing he was stepping down like 3 days ago. And then the next day it's like, oh, no, he's not. He's fighting against the Democrats. You're trying to force him to do it. And that in itself is crazy, because no wonder I think people
don't trust it, or they get
don't trust news, because it's just always, and it's not like, and that's the thing. I feel like if you watch like an actual news, and I mean, I hate to say this because when I say actual news, I'm not talking about fake news or what's true, but if I'm watching like, I don't know, Channel 3 News, they're going to just all they do is report facts. Like, they're not giving you any information. They're not kind of adding their opinion to things. They'll just say like, oh, hey, today in Columbus, there was a shooting on 5th Street, and here's what we know about it. And that's it. And it goes on to the next story. So it's almost like they're just hitting the highlights and kind of a little bit of information, where when you get to your cable news thing, not only are you getting that, but then you get people kind of talking about it, chatting about it. And I think that's what kind of gives so much confusion because you can take so much opinion and even just rumors as actual news.
Yeah,
So,
and I think too, I think you're exactly right. But like, I was telling my wife, this was a couple of weeks ago, but like we had um a tornado warning a couple of weeks ago, and we were sitting at sitting in our living room, and like there was a break in the storm, and so we had a tornado warning, and then there wasn't a tornado warning, and then there was a tornado warning, and the meteorologists were like, uh, this isn't gonna produce a tornado per se, but it's a storm that's like capable of producing a tornado, but it's not going to produce a tornado. And it was kind of this back and forth of like, are we going to have a tornado or not? Do we need to like sit in the basement or not? And I was telling my wife the next day after that evening of storms that it's like it seems like ever since the pandemic, ever since COVID-19, that it seems that everything is a little bit more on edge. And what I mean by that is that like every bit of news, whether it's weather, whether it's COVID, whether it's politics, whether it's your local news, somebody got shot, somebody was murdered, whatever. And I'm not discounting any of those things. However, it just seems like everything is worst case scenario now. And like you said, Scott, like 3 days ago, 4 days ago, you were like, President Biden's going to step down. Well, is he or is he not? And like we sit here, and I think it's a marketing tactic, really, because like you sit there and you just sit there and stare at the screen, or sit there and stare at your phone, waiting to be the first one to hear whether or not that's happened or it's truly happened, in order to um, we what's I think it's kind of fitting that we're talking about social media today, but like what's there's a term that folks use um when using social media, and it's like they're the first to hear about something, or they're the first to see the information.
mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's like, you know, same thing with like trailers for movies that I'm excited to see, right? Like I can't
Mm-hmm.
wait to be the first one to watch that trailer. It's almost like this greed satisfaction.
Oh yeah.
You talked about Peter a little bit ago, and kind of like this uh not anxiety, but the just fidgetiness, being fidgety
Yeah.
towards consumer. That was the word I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
We're a very consumer driven society these days.
Yeah.
And that includes news and media, and uh, it's like they knew Biden was going to drop out like 5 days ago, but they just dropped it yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you just sat on the edge of your bed if you're really interested in that kind of thing, and waited for it to actually happen. And now
Yeah.
people are just like, well, what's going to happen now? So
Yeah.
anyway, that was a long.
Yeah. Well, and even that, like, if you go back to, I mean, I'd say if you even go back to the early 2000s, I mean, print journalism is kind of a dying career. My nephew from Ireland, um, him and his mom were here doing college tours, and they ended up checking out Anderson University and Taylor University. And Taylor University is where my sister-in-law went to school to go be a journalist. And they're walking around campus, and there's the building which was the journalist building, and she's talking about, oh, this is the building, I've always been in this building for journalism. And her son kind of looked inside the window, and he goes, Mom, this building's completely empty, there's nothing in here. And she looked inside the window, she's like, oh my gosh, you're right, like there's nothing. And it's almost now, with especially with just our social media, the rise of social media, and just how much of consumer driven we are, we don't really want reporters, we want influencers. And because we want influencers, we're so lucky, instead of like, here's a reporter that is actually doing the work, actually getting information from, like, the AP or the Associated Press or Reuters or whatever, like, are kind of like your big news like sites to get your news around the world. And it's almost like, oh, actually, I'm going to follow this person on TikTok because they always seem to bring up news stories. And sometimes he'll say stuff like, oh, hey, a week ago he was saying Biden's going to drop out of the race, and next he does. So apparently this guy has sources that can, like, that can kind of give me information faster than what the news is bringing it. So I'm going to trust in that. And that
Well,
becomes a very dangerous game.
yeah, and it's like you said, it's like influencer is a good word for it because like if you scroll on TikTok, everybody's got an opinion, everybody's got a thought, everybody's trying to make money, everybody's trying, and like if you didn't want to watch the news, you wouldn't have to. If you didn't have cable, you wouldn't watch it. Like it's truly
Yeah,
fascinating.
it is. It is. And you bring up a good point, like how many people are actually subscribed to cable television services now?
Yeah.
Not many.
Not ma-
So, a lot of people stream stuff. So the fact that, you know, you can reach me or you can reach me through TikTok or Instagram or X or Facebook, that's where you're going to get me. I mean, you're not going to get me on like a normal television or cable network because I'm not watching television or cable network. Yeah. So, but as far as, but going back to your earlier point about about Joe Biden, it's interesting to see because yeah, like it wasn't Lyndon B. Johnson was like the last person that happened to. So we haven't seen it in years, and now we're seeing it kind of unfold. However, Micah, you and I have talked repeatedly on this show in regards to ministry that sometimes older ministers continue to hold on to the job when they are, I'm not going to say they're not effective, but they hold on too long. So then by the time when the next person comes in, they've kind of inherited a mess, or they just have problems trying to do anything new because everything was done a certain way for so long that people just kind of got used to it. So the fact that we have a older person who goes, what is he like? Joe Biden's what, 78?
He's 80, he's 81.
Oh, 81. Okay, so
I
a
think.
lot older. All right. So, he's up there.
He's
He's
81. He's 81.
81 years old. And for him to basically say, I'm stepping down because A, I don't think I can do the job, but B, or maybe he still thinks he can do the job, but I'm stepping down. I think he said, he's doing it for the betterment of America and he's doing it for the betterment of his party, right? So when you think about all that information, the fact that he's saying, okay, I'm going to take a step back because I'm not what the country needs right now. We need somebody else who's willing to do that because, again, like he could be, I mean, even if we get to election, he wins his second term. I mean, how much are we going to see? And especially if his doctors are checking him out and going, hey, we have some concerns here. Like, that's another issue too that you have to think about. So I think in some ways, I think it's kind of very respectable that he is stepping down, knowing that, hey, I may not be able to do this anymore. I may not be able to. And I mean, I think in some ways, and I think that's kind of the hard part too, because even after the announcement, it was split down the aisle. You have people who are saying, oh, this is what a true patriot is. This is someone who really loves their country, that they're willing to kind of walk away and step down for the betterment of the entire country. And then you have people who are bashing the guy and saying, oh, this guy's weak. This guy's, I mean, I know the former president made some harsh words about the announcement too. So, I mean, it's hard.
Which
And I
one?
think the former, President Trump.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, because I said I saw something yesterday or today, early this morning, that Obama was he was talking about how courageous Biden is. However, it's time to go. Like he was kind of towing the line in respect to
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is. I think it's going to be, and I, like you said, we are living in a very interesting part of history within this country. There's just a lot of stuff going on, and we're going to be seeing, we're going to be seeing a lot of interesting things come out, and it should be interesting to see what these next, 100 days are going to tell, and they'll be interesting. So, yeah. So, for me, stories gone wild. I'll talk a little bit about social media because mine kind of fits with kind of our topic today. So when I was interning at a church, the youth pastor there was utilizing social media in its earliest form to really connect with kids, using things like texting, email, Facebook, etc. And for the most part, youth pastor had a really great plan, really, really good, and kind of understood the dynamics of the do's and don'ts of social media when especially it comes to kids. So fast forward, I'm working at a church now. I'm not interning there. I have like my own church I'm doing. And I can't remember. And again, I think it was kind of like in that transition period when I was in Ohio, moving to Virginia, or I just got to Virginia. But there's one particular student on there who would put stuff on Facebook, and a lot of times very concerning stuff. Like he would, usually use inappropriate language on Facebook, or occasionally he'll put stuff like, "Oh, my stepdad just beat the crap out of me," or something. Put this stuff out there on Facebook for all the world to see. It's like, okay, there's some concerning stuff here. So one time he got on there and he was, must have had another altercation with his stepfather. So he's up there and he's ranting and raving, using expletives and everything. Well, then the senior pastor happened to see this post and decided to comment on it, and basically said, "Hey, you shouldn't use that type of language. You go to church with us. You're not being a very great representative of Christ," and basically was telling this kid, "What you're doing is wrong, and you are not representing the church well," and blah, 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 blah. And didn't send this in a message, sent this right on his Facebook page. So immediately, this kid sees that and unfriends every single person associated with the church, including the youth pastor. Now, the youth pastor saw it, and then he's like, "Okay, well, something's going on, so I'll talk to him at church, or I'll try to reach out to him, talk to him at church." Well, because the lead pastor put that message on there, the youth pastor could not reach him. He tried to call or text him. Kid would not answer the phone, and completely lost that kid. And the youth leader was ticked off, and even said, "If you were going to say," and he even said, "You don't know this kid's situation. He's going through a lot. And I wish you didn't have say anything. You should have just not have commented, or if you were going to comment, at least send a private message so he didn't feel embarrassed, because you just embarrassed the poor kid in front of all his friends and everybody who was on Facebook." And, I think that's kind of why I think social media in some ways is a very powerful tool, not only for connection, but it's also very powerful for deconnection too. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's kind of a great example of, a good way and a bad way to use social media. So our topic today is, how do we use social media, especially when we engage younger generations or youth? So I guess we'll just start off with the basic question: is social media a good tool to connect with teens?
I was thinking about this last night when you texted me, and I would say yes, and because you have to be careful, obviously, with teenagers, for a variety of reasons. You know, one that you just illustrated so well. You don't know what kids are going through. There could be problems at home with parents. There could be things like self harm, mental health, etc., going on with the individual. Also, you don't want to. On the flip side of that, like as the pastor, as the leader, as the team lead, um, you have to be careful how you're communicating with your students what you're communicating to your students and when you're communicating to your students. And I think all those things are prevalent with social media and the conversation of social media today. Um, and it's interesting. I mean, I'm not trying to date you or say that you're old, but you're talking about the illustration in Stores Gone Wild was Facebook. The kids today are like using things like Snapchat and
Yeah.
TikTok and some other platforms, Instagram to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
But social media is evolving at such a rapid rate these days that it's hard to keep up. And um, I think we have to be mindful of the trends that are going on, but also having to keep in mind that we need to navigate them accordingly, if that makes sense. And you know, as a youth pastor, as a middle aged male youth pastor, me in this example, I'm not going to be Snapchatting my teenagers, right? Like I
Mm.
just don't. I think you can make like something like a Snapchat story similar to what you can do in Facebook and Instagram, and say, "Hey, there's church tonight," and then make like a little reel or a video or something, but not include anything about you, like your face or anything that involves you, um, and send it to your students that way. But like again, you just have to be mindful of the situation and you know your audience,
Mm-hmm.
which is hard to do as a youth pastor.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, it is, I think social media in some ways is really good because social media is kind of like the Wild West in some ways. There's
Sure.
always new, I mean, there's always new apps that are being produced, like social media apps that are targeted to younger people. And sometimes when you see that, you have to go, okay, is this a way for me to, is this going to be something that's going to be great and connect with? Or is this something that's going to not connect well with people?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it going to be like, so for an example, I think like a year or two ago, someone told me about Be Real. I'm like, okay, what's Be Real? And it's like, oh, it's like a thing where you take a picture a day and it's kind of
And
like,
you talk about your day.
it's just basically about your day. You just take a picture. It's like it takes a picture of both the front camera and the back camera. So it's like your face and then whatever you're looking at. You can kind of see all that. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So I was on that, and I had a few students who are on there, but then they quickly kind of dropped out of it. And it's like, oh, okay. And it's this past year, actually this summer, a couple of my students on mission trip goes, oh, Pastor Scott, you should get a Snapchat. And I'm like, do I really want to deal with another like social media? Because I really don't. Um, but I'm like, okay, so I get it. And then someone goes, "Oh, Pastor Scott, why'd you do this?" Like, I don't even know what the heck you're saying. Like, I don't know what you mean. So they're like, showing me like how to use this app because I'm like, that's when I officially knew, gosh dang, I'm an old man because now I have to have someone teach me how to use an app because I have no clue how to use it. So, needless to say, they showed me how to use it. So, and for me, when I'm thinking about it, it's like not only was it like, okay, here's some of my students on missions trip that I'm connecting with, but then all these other kids, because when we do confirmation, sometimes we have kids that are just regular kids that come to church regularly. And then I occasionally will get kids from the community who will be a part of, who will come and join and be a part of it. But then, I never see them again. Maybe if I'm walking in the community, I may see them, I may talk to them. So for me, it's like, okay, when those kids are now asking to be my friend on Snapchat, it's like, this is a great way to still continue to build relationships and connect with those kids that just by personal interaction, I don't have any connection with. Now, at the same time, you do bring up a good point. I'm not going to be just like randomly Snapchatting my students all the time. And I think there is a kind of a danger in some ways. I think you and I have even maybe shared about all these different church scandals that have happened. I mean, every time when there's a new church scandal, we usually will say something about it. Or if we're not saying it on this podcast, usually you and me are like sharing information back and forth and going, man, this is crazy. Like, what the heck is this? Like, this is messed up. So we see all that. And I think a lot of times, especially with youth ministers, especially whether male or female, sometimes when you're dealing with teens, and the thing about teenagers is teenagers are going through a lot of different changes. Their minds are changing, their bodies are changing, the whole biology of them are changing.
A
And
lot of
sometimes
hormones.
a lot of hormones are being produced. So a lot of times you can have students who are in a state of confusion. They maybe, and especially if they're living in a home where there's a lot of stuff going on, where like, oh, my parents don't care about me, my parents don't love me, or I'm being mistreated in my home, I'm being mistreated by a stepfather or stepmother, whatever case may be. A lot of times, and again, watching documentaries on church scandals and abuse, research, all this stuff, one of the MOs is when you have a kid who's kind of feeling low about themselves, that's a perfect time for somebody in a position of power, like a youth minister or a pastor, to be able to, in such a way, take advantage of
Take
that,
advantage of the situation. Yeah.
of the situation. And especially with social media, if that's just a gateway or a door that you can open up and look into their private lives and make comments about certain things, about, encouraging them, being nice, maybe even kind of teetering that line of saying something that's like mildly inappropriate, but it's not like to the point where it may be necessarily a fireable, comment. That can definitely start paving the way for a lot of abuse to happen. So, is social media good for teens? Yes, it is. But it can also be a gateway for a lot of abuse to happen too with adults, and not just youth pastors, but even youth workers and teenagers as well. So as a church and as a pastor, you have to be very careful on how you use social media to communicate with students.
So as a youth pastor, Scott, family life, youth, whatever, I think you're still family life, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But you cover children's and youth. How are you using social media today to communicate with your students?
Yeah.
Or
So
are
that's
you?
a good. So that's a great question, because a lot of times, what I have been doing. So my big thing is at the beginning of when I got here, my big thing was to communicate with parents. For me, it's like I want to communicate with parents. So a lot of my stuff had been just sending emails to parents. And then kids, I just normally would to give announcements, verbal announcements to kids, talk to them, do whatever in person. But I never really engaged with social media and kids, because at this point, I don't know what they're using.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing, like, back like this, the Stories Gone Wild example I gave, at that point, you really just had Facebook and Twitter were like your two main platforms that people really communicated on. I think even, and I don't remember, but I think even just Snapchat was just more pictures. And now I think Snapchat has a feature where you can actually type in, like, chat with people without doing pictures. You can do that. Well, with people who you're friends with, not just random people, but with people who you're friends with. So with all that being said, eventually when we had our first like missions trip that I did, one of the big things I told them, I'm like, hey, everybody needs to text me your phone number, because that was the way I was going to say, hey, we're having lunch here, let's meet. Hey, where's everybody at? If there's people who are missing, it's like, hey, I might text one person, say, hey, where are you? And are these people with you? So then that way I had a better way of kind of communicating in real time where everybody is, where we're supposed to meet, and kind of have a good way of doing that. And that worked fine. And I even kind of told them, and I even told the kids straight up, really all I'm using this is a communicative tool to just get information. I'm not going to sit here and I'm not going to like be like, hey, what's going on? Let's party or what's or anything else. I'm just going to say, hey, where are you? Here's where we're meeting. Come here. And that's what we're going to use it for. Now, eventually the kids started to use kind of the youth group chat kind of to talk to each other. Like occasionally I'll say, hey, we have youth group tonight. Here's the game we're playing. Here's the lesson we're talking about. And occasionally I will hear people go, hey, is anybody going? Anybody going? It's like, oh, I'm going. So then in some way that helped me like, okay, at least I have 5 people who are showing up. Maybe, and sometimes I'll get like 12 or 15. I'm like, okay, that's pretty good. Or other times I might be like, oh no, I'm going to so-and-so's bar mitzvah. Yeah, I'm going. So then I kind of knew like, oh, there's a bar mitzvah going on in the community, which basically means almost every single kid is going to be at that bar mitzvah. So I'm probably not going to have anybody at youth tonight. So it's good to kind of know that stuff. So for primarily, that was the way I used it. Now, occasionally now, like with Snapchat or like with Instagram, like actually Snapchat's probably the one way that a lot of kids will connect with me. And they'll just ask questions like, hey, are we having youth tonight or something? And I'll be like, oh no, we don't have youth over summer. We have we have it in the morning at 10 o'clock. We have a Bible study. Oh, okay. And that's pretty much it. But for the most part, everything that I do as far as communicated with students is always based on information on the church. Occasionally, if I see that it's their birthday, I may just shoot like a Snapchat text and say, hey, happy birthday. I hope you have a great day. And then that's it. Or if I knew that a kid had surgery, I could text the kid. That's the funny thing. If I have that kid's phone number, I could text the kid saying, hey, how'd your surgery go? Get nothing back. I could send something through Snapchat. And again, a lot of students, they don't even take pictures of themselves. They'll take a picture of the ceiling or they'll take a picture of the floor. They never take a picture of themselves. They'll take a picture of a ceiling. So, I'll take a picture of a ceiling. I'll put a text like, how's your surgery? And then I'll get something back, a picture of like a desk. Oh, my surgery went well. Thank you for praying for me.
Isn't that crazy?
But it's funny because I send them, it's almost like how people, like you call people on the phone and they won't answer, but you can shoot them a text and they'll get back to you like within a second. I feel like now it's the opposite. I can send a text, get nothing back. I can send a Snapchat and I'll get something back instantaneously. So for me, it's very, very interesting. At the same time, there's sometimes some things that happen that are kind of awkward too. And you're just like, I really don't need to engage in that right now. And so I kind of back off a little bit. But yeah. So that's kind of how I've been using it, really for church purposes, usually just for communicative things, just to let people know, hey, here's an event. And then occasionally I may shoot something if it's a special occasion, like, oh, it's your birthday, happy birthday. Or occasionally I may send something to the big group chat. Hey, we have this event at the church. We need some people to kind of watch kids. Are there any youth available to watch kids for a couple hours at the church? And again, this is a paid position. And then I'll get a response, hey, I can do it. Like, okay. And then usually I might get a one-on-one text saying, hey, Pastor Scott, did anybody say they can do it? I'll say, oh, no. It's like, okay, I can do it. I'm like, all right, well, here's where you need to meet. We're meeting here. It starts here. It ends here. And here's how much you're getting paid. And then if any one-on-one conversations I have. And that's kind of how I use it. Now, one thing that I think was very important is, I always make sure that parents know that I do have a text group with their students. So then that way they know that they can get a hold of me. They can text me if anything's going on and that I'm an open book. At the same time, I think even now with just social media in general, if you say something stupid or you do something stupid, that student's definitely going to show their parents what you put or a video or picture you send them. And eventually it's going to get to a point where you're going to be like, okay, like, yeah, this is definitely inappropriate. And we're going to send this to HR, to the pastor or whatever. But I think, for me, I think starting with the parents, letting parents know, hey, here's how I'm communicating with your kids, so that they are aware of, this is how I'm communicating with your kids. And then that way, if parents are for it, they're like, okay. And if parents are against it, that's fine too. They just don't, their kids just don't be part of the Snapchat group, or they're not part of the texting group or whatever. And then that way, and I still just continue to communicate to them via email or whatnot. So yeah, so that's kind of how I do it. I know the pastor at the church at Internet, he actually had like a form that kids would sign out. And it basically went, it was like a contract saying, hey, here's how we're going to contact you. What number do you want us to contact with? Your name. And then also there's this thing, hey, here's our texting policy, here's our social media policy. And they're very clear. This is what this is for. And this is how we're going to use it. And anything beyond that would be considered an overreach of this contract, and there could be penalized. And not only did kids sign it, but even youth workers signed it too. So they even know you're not going to be having flirty text back and forth with a student, because that would be against. And I think occasionally, there will be a time where they may check phones, or at least the youth pastor will start checking phones of their workers. And then usually the senior pastor would check the chat log of the youth pastor, just to make sure that everything's good, everything's kosher, and that there's no issues going on. And then even have a way of how do you report it too, and that, you should report if something is a little uncomfortable or wrong, you should definitely report it. And I think that's a good system too, just to have something in writing so that the student, the parent, and youth workers and pastors know this is the right way to use social media at our church. Here's our policy, here's what we do. And I think that's a good method too for people to have it. So any follow-up questions from you, Micah, about that? You're muted, Micah. I'm like, I don't know if you're talking to me or if you're just reading something off your phone.
Mark for edit.
Mark for
No,
edit.
I think that you and I are on the same page, and my experience is a little bit different. With pastoring young adults and being a worship guy, like I did social media for the church, like in a broad scale. I'm not communicating with one person directly, if that makes sense. And if I did get a message, through the church account, like, and it was suspicious or I needed a clarification, like everybody who had access to the page could see it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like, it's a one-on-one thing and nobody else could see it. With the college age kids, the young adult ministry stuff that I used to do, we had a Facebook page, but we also, made sure to, announce those things, in service, on social media, things like a group text. And I know of other apps too that I've heard of student ministry pastors using, and young adult pastors using, that are like, I guess, safer options that protect you as the leader.
Oh yeah.
So that it's not just hanging out there like a Snapchat, like an Instagram, like a, etc. I remember one time, and I should have used this as my story's gone wild, but I remember I was working in a church and somebody had hacked my Facebook account. And so it was back in the day when, people were hacking your Facebook accounts, and like they would post inappropriate stuff on your page. And so like I had a board member call me and say, why is this on your Facebook page? I don't, like, threatening to like call a board meeting and stuff. And I'm like, somebody hacked my Facebook page. I just need to get on there, change the password, delete the post, XYZ. but they were really upset with me.
Yeah.
I had no control over it, but that's part of the danger of social media because there's so many um, people out there trying to hack your information. And that, I mean, that you could even talk about bank accounts and things like that, your credit cards, and um, where people can hack and steal information and essentially ruin your life and steal your identity. But with the social media conversation, I think it's better to be safe than sorry. I like the idea of uh, a group text uh, because everybody can see it. I like the idea of letting the parents know because at least they're in the know and you know they have an idea of what's going on with their kid. It gives parents another another level of reassurance and respect to what's going on with their kid at church. And
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's funny that you mentioned, Scott, that like you could send 5 text messages to a teenager and they don't respond, or you could call them and they don't answer. But the second you send them a Snapchat, they'll respond.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with students at Miami over the years. It's the same deal. It's like, what's Facebook? You're so old.
Oh yeah.
And it's like, but if you talk about Instagram or if you talk about TikTok, it's like they're all about it. Snapchat. Um, it's a crazy concept.
It
Um,
is.
but yeah. Do you have any other thoughts about?
Um, yeah, I think the other thing that I think is important too, and this may be for any students who may be listening to it, like any youth who may be listening to it, you know, the fact of the matter is if a youth leader, pastor, youth pastor, whoever, anybody from the church, if they are sending you stuff or they're messaging you that makes you feel uncomfortable, immediately say something to that person and say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this, and kind of walk away. And then also, if it still goes on, then you need to talk to somebody, like either tell your parents or tell the pastor or tell the pastor above that pastor or that youth worker that is messaging you. On the same side, if you are a pastor, if you are a youth worker, you're a youth minister, if you're somehow got into a conversation with a student that is very awkward, then stop having that conversation with them and report it. Like, and that kind of happened to me. So like when my students told me, hey, get a Snapchat, I'm like, okay, get a Snapchat. And I'm seeing all these other people or like who are asking me to be their friends. I'm like, okay, I know this person. This is a confirmation student. So I'm like, okay, yep, add. But then there was like another student that was on there and I didn't recognize the name. I'm like, I have no clue who this person is. And they just sat there like as in my like accept to be a friend thing on Snapchat. And I'm like, I don't know who it is. But then, it's like, well, they have mutual friends. So obviously they're friends with my students. Occasionally we have bring a friend days in youth groups. So this may be like one of those people who know me. I'm like, okay, cool. So I'm like, well, maybe this is person. They kind of look, and again, you can't really tell because Snapchats, it's all like Bitmojis. So it's not like their real picture, their real face. It's like a cartoon character. So I'm like, well, maybe this is so and so. So I'm like, okay, well, I went ahead and just hit accept. Next thing you know, this person starts messaging me and starts asking me questions. I'm like, okay. And then they start asking me about what grade I'm in. I'm like, oh, I'm not a student. I'm an old man. And she goes, really? I'm like, yeah. Like, and I even mentioned, I'm a pastor in town. I'm the pastor of a lot of students here in Bexley. So, that's so you probably confused me. You probably thought maybe I was like a student, but I'm not. But then she's like, oh, here, show me a picture. I want to know what you look like. And I'm like, nah, I'm not gonna do it. So then I went and messaged one of my students, hey, do you know who this person is? And they're like, yeah, we know who that is. I'm like, they're like a year under us. I'm like, okay. okay, just was curious. And then I just kind of left it at that. But I never sent a picture of that person. I never commented back. I'm like, I'm not talking to this person anymore just because I thought it was somebody and it wasn't. It's like, it's getting, and I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable. So I'm like, I'm not going to engage. No, like I thought it was someone I knew. Apparently it's nobody. It's someone that my friends know, like my other students know who it is, but they're not really anybody who they brought to church. I'm like, okay, well, in that case, I'm not going to engage that person. I'm sure they're a nice person. I'm sure they're wonderful. But, for me, the whole point of social media is for church people and church students and just trying to communicate church events. So I don't need to be getting into a conversation with a student. Like for me, I just felt that was very uncomfortable for me and I just didn't want to do it. So just kind of ended it. And eventually I just kind of like removed them. That's my friend. Like, nope, I don't know who you are. So, I mean, and I think that's fine too. So, yeah. So I think, overall, when it comes to social media, just be smart. And I would say even this, like, I'd say be very, I'd say be very conservative with how you use social media. If you're kind of on that thing where it's like, well, I'm sure this is okay, but I'm still kind of don't really know. Even if you have like a 10% chance of like you not knowing if this is okay, then I would go with that 10%. Even if it's a 1% like feeling like, yeah, I don't know if this is okay or not. I wouldn't do it. I would, or worst case scenario, I would talk to other of your youth workers. If you have volunteers, I talk to them about it. Or I'd talk to, your pastor and just say, hey, here's the situation, or hey, I'm thinking about trying to do this through social media. However, I have some hesitations. Is it okay if I talk this through my ideas and then try to get some feedback? Maybe they can kind of help you figure out a better plan or a better way to engage social media in a way that's going to be effective, going to kind of hit your vision, but also it's going to be safe for you as the person who's running it, and also for the people that you are trying to reach or communicate through that social media method.
Yeah. It's a tricky thing, but you got to be careful.
It is. It is. And now, I'll get like, I've been getting like Facebook messages and text messages from students at the previous churches I worked at because they're now adults now, like they've graduated. And, occasionally I'll get like messages from them just seeing how I'm doing. I'm like, I'm doing great. How are you doing? I'm glad you're doing great. Glad that you're doing well in school. I'm glad that you got a job and you're happy. Like, and that's pretty much it. Like, I'm not going like, hey, you want to go out and have lunch? Like, no, like I'm not doing that sort of thing. Like, or if someone does invite me to lunch, it's like, okay, well, I may do it. I'm going to probably say no, but if I'm comfortable with it, I'm at least going to let everybody know, hey, I'm having lunch with this person at this time, and I should be back in my office, or even like with my wife. I'm having lunch with one of my former students, and then I'm going to be back home at this time. Here's where we're meeting. Here's what we're doing. And then I should be back home, and I'm immediately coming back home afterwards. So that way, if anything weird goes wrong, or if my wife's like, man, it's a 3-hour lunchtime, what the heck's going on? At least she knows, and he's supposed to be back a couple hours ago. I'm going to call him and figure out where the heck he is. And then, so, make sure you always have like an accountability thing set up too, just so, whether that's in writing or whether that's a verbal agreement that you have with your staff, make sure we're being safe and make sure we're being smart with the way we're using social media.
Absolutely.
Yep. And as we begin to wrap up this topic, also one thing that you might look at is if you're someone who's like trying to figure out social media, or you want to start social media, first of all, there's a lot of way you can look at like a lot of websites that can teach you like the do's and don'ts of using social media with your students. But I would also, if you're part of a denomination, I would suggest looking at your denomination, like your main denominational page, and maybe they have some resources on how to use it. And if it doesn't, look at others. I know the discipleship ministries of the UMC, they have a bunch of resources on how to recruit volunteers, to how to use social media safely. Like they're very good at equipping churches on how to use these certain things. So even if you're a Baptist and you're like, man, our denomination, our state site, our national website has nothing about social media, check out other denominations. They might have something that can help you navigate certain things, or say, oh, okay, the Lutheran Church has something on how to use social media to engage with kids, or they have like a template of like a social media like contract or a covenant or whatever word you want to use. Like, I may steal this, or I may use that as an example and make my own. So, there's a lot of stuff out there. So if you're kind of like in the weeds, or if this is new territory for you, like, I don't know how to use this properly, whether you're starting out and you're young, or you're old and you're dealing with students like me, that's a great way to be able to engage and use those platforms. So again, guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful to any of you who are listening. If so, please leave us a comment or a message. We definitely will greatly appreciate it. And we'll be back on with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.